I'm Rachel, 31, and I thought my engagement to James would be cause for celebration in my family, especially after 5 years of building a loving relationship that had grown stronger through every challenge we'd faced together. Instead, it became the moment my mother looked me dead in the eye and delivered an ultimatum that would change our family forever. Rachel, you need to cancel your wedding and give Vanessa your date. She needs this more than you do, and if you refuse, you're no longer part of this family. The silence that followed was broken by my golden child sister Vanessa's smug smile as she waited for me to sacrifice my happiness for hers once again. What they didn't know was that their demand had just triggered a war that would expose 31 years of favoritism, financial manipulation, and family secrets that would destroy their perfect image forever. But before I tell you how I systematically dismantled the family hierarchy that had oppressed me for decades, I need to know, what would you have done if your family demanded you sacrifice your wedding for your siblings' convenience? Would you have given in to keep the peace? Cut contact immediately? Or declared total war on the people who'd been treating you as disposable your entire life? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe because this golden child warfare is about to get absolutely devastating. To understand how my mother's wedding ultimatum became the catalyst for exposing decades of systematic favoritism and family dysfunction, you need to know about the carefully constructed hierarchy that had positioned my younger sister Vanessa as the family princess while relegating me to the role of supporting character in my own life. From the moment Vanessa was born when I was 7 years old, she'd been treated as the miracle child whose needs, wants, and whims took priority over everyone else's, including my own basic rights to attention, resources, and parental love. Vanessa was everything my mother had always dreamed of having in a daughter: naturally beautiful, effortlessly charming, socially gifted, and blessed with the kind of magnetic personality that made people want to give her whatever she asked for without question. Her golden blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and perfect features had made her a local celebrity from childhood, winning beauty pageants and modeling competitions that brought prestige and validation to our mother's parenting reputation. I, on the other hand, had been the practice child, the daughter who'd served as a trial run for parenting while my mother figured out what she really wanted in a family dynamic. My brown hair, average features, and serious personality had been treated as disappointing compared to Vanessa's effortless beauty and social success. Every achievement I'd earned through hard work and determination had been overshadowed by Vanessa's natural talents and the attention they generated from our parents and extended family. The financial disparities between our childhoods had been stark and consistent. Vanessa's beauty pageant gowns, dance lessons, modeling headshots, and competition travel expenses had consumed the majority of our family's discretionary income, while my requests for music lessons, art supplies, or academic enrichment programs had been denied due to budget constraints that somehow never applied to Vanessa's expensive hobbies and activities. When Vanessa had decided she wanted to attend an expensive private college to study communications and theater, our parents had liquidated their retirement savings and taken out substantial loans to ensure she could pursue her dreams without the burden of student debt. When I'd been accepted to an equally prestigious university to study engineering, the response had been congratulations followed by detailed discussions about student loans, work-study programs, and the importance of choosing a practical degree that would ensure quick repayment of educational expenses. The pattern had continued into our adult lives, as Vanessa's creative career as a freelance photographer and social media influencer had been subsidized by family financial support that enabled her to pursue artistic fulfillment rather than financial stability. Her beautiful apartment, expensive equipment, and constant travel for photography projects were partially funded by our parents, who viewed her creative success as validation of their investment in her artistic development. My career as a software engineer, while more financially stable and professionally respected, had never generated the same pride and enthusiasm from our parents as Vanessa's Instagram followers and photography awards. The steady income and benefits that made me financially independent were treated as less impressive than Vanessa's creative achievements and social media influence, despite the fact that my success required no family financial support. The romantic relationships in our lives had been subject to the same double standard that characterized every other aspect of our family dynamic. Vanessa's boyfriends were always welcomed enthusiastically, treated as potential sons-in-law regardless of their character, employment status, or treatment of her. Her pattern of dating artistic but financially unstable men was seen as evidence of her romantic and creative spirit rather than poor judgment about partnership and life planning. James, my fiancé of 5 years, was a successful architect who owned his own firm, treated me with genuine love and respect, and had patiently endured years of family gatherings where he was treated politely but never embraced with the enthusiasm that Vanessa's boyfriends received. Despite his professional success, financial stability, and obvious devotion to me, our parents had always seemed to view our relationship as sensible rather than romantic, practical rather than passionate. The engagement announcement that should have been a moment of family celebration had instead been met with polite congratulations followed immediately by concerns about timing, expenses, and the potential impact on Vanessa's own romantic prospects. My mother's first question after seeing my engagement ring had been whether James and I planned to have a long engagement that wouldn't interfere with Vanessa's social calendar or dating life. The wedding planning process had revealed the extent to which our family's resources and attention were automatically directed toward Vanessa's needs rather than my own milestones and celebrations. Every decision James and I made about our ceremony was scrutinized for its potential impact on Vanessa's comfort and convenience, while her opinions about our choices carried more weight than our own preferences about our own wedding. But what had pushed the family dynamic from simple favoritism to active sabotage was Vanessa's recent breakup with her latest boyfriend, a struggling musician who'd ended their 2-year relationship to pursue a recording contract in Los Angeles. Her heartbreak over losing someone who'd never been financially stable or emotionally mature had been treated by our parents as a family crisis that required everyone's attention and support. The timing of Vanessa's romantic crisis, coinciding with my wedding planning, had created what our mother viewed as competing demands for family emotional energy and financial resources. The solution she'd proposed, canceling my wedding to give Vanessa time to heal and potentially find a new relationship that might lead to her own engagement, revealed the depth of the favoritism that had shaped our family for decades. The ultimatum about canceling my wedding or losing my family had been delivered with the confidence of someone who'd spent 31 years successfully manipulating family dynamics to prioritize Vanessa's needs over everyone else's rights and feelings. My mother's certainty that I would comply with her demand showed how completely she'd misunderstood both my character and my capacity for fighting back against the systematic favoritism that had oppressed me since childhood. What she was about to discover was that the daughter she'd treated as expendable had actually been documenting and planning for exactly this kind of ultimatum, and that my response would destroy not just the family hierarchy but the carefully constructed image of family harmony that had hidden years of financial manipulation and emotional abuse. The day after my mother's ultimatum about canceling my wedding, I began the most systematic investigation of my adult life, using every resource available to me as a software engineer and data analyst to uncover the full scope of the financial favoritism and potential fraud that had shaped our family dynamics for decades. What started as emotional curiosity about the extent of Vanessa's financial support evolved into a comprehensive audit that revealed criminal behavior that could result in serious legal consequences for my parents. My access to financial databases through my work in cybersecurity, combined with my knowledge of our family's personal information and banking history, allowed me to piece together a financial picture that was far more damaging than simple parental favoritism. The systematic redirection of family resources toward Vanessa's lifestyle had included transactions that constituted fraud, tax evasion, and misappropriation of funds that belonged to other family members, including me. The first major discovery was that my college fund, which I'd been told had been depleted to pay for my education, had actually been transferred to accounts that funded Vanessa's private college expenses and living costs during her 6 years of undergraduate and graduate school. The money that our grandmother had specifically designated for my educational expenses had been redirected to support Vanessa's extended academic career without my knowledge or consent. The documentation showed that approximately $180,000 that had been earmarked for my education through a trust fund established by our late grandmother had been systematically transferred to cover Vanessa's college tuition, apartment rent, study abroad programs, and living expenses that far exceeded what any reasonable educational budget would include. The trust document clearly specified that the money was intended solely for my educational expenses, making its redirection to Vanessa a clear violation of the trust terms and potentially criminal misappropriation. But the educational fund theft was just the beginning of what I discovered through my financial investigation. My parents had been claiming Vanessa as a dependent on their tax returns long after she'd aged out of eligibility, using fraudulent documentation to reduce their tax liability while claiming benefits they weren't entitled to receive. The savings from this tax fraud had been used to fund additional support for Vanessa's lifestyle and career development. The most shocking discovery was that my parents had been using my identity and credit history to obtain loans and credit lines that were used to fund Vanessa's business expenses and personal lifestyle costs. My excellent credit score and stable employment history had been leveraged to secure financing that I'd never applied for or authorized, creating debts that were technically in my name but had been used exclusively for Vanessa's benefit. The identity theft that my parents had committed included opening credit cards in my name, using my personal information to secure business loans for Vanessa's photography equipment, and even listing me as a co-signer on apartment leases that I'd never seen or agreed to. The total amount of unauthorized debt in my name exceeded $85,000, money that had funded Vanessa's artistic career while potentially destroying my own financial future. The investigation also revealed that our parents had been systematically underreporting income and assets to qualify for government benefits and tax advantages that they weren't entitled to receive. The financial support they'd been providing to Vanessa had been structured to hide their true financial capacity while maximizing their ability to claim hardship and need-based assistance. But perhaps the most damaging evidence was documentation showing that my parents had been lying to extended family members about the source of funding for Vanessa's lifestyle and career development. Relatives who'd contributed money for educational expenses and family emergencies had actually been funding Vanessa's photography equipment, travel expenses, and luxury lifestyle while being told their money was needed for medical bills and urgent family needs. The financial records also showed that money I'd contributed to family expenses and emergency funds over the years had been redirected to support Vanessa's career and lifestyle rather than the legitimate family needs I'd been told required my assistance. Every dollar I'd provided to help with household expenses, medical bills, or emergency repairs had actually been part of a fraudulent scheme to maximize the financial support available for Vanessa's pursuits. The scope of financial manipulation extended beyond just monetary theft to include insurance fraud, where my parents had been claiming benefits for Vanessa's medical expenses and therapy costs that were actually related to cosmetic procedures and lifestyle coaching rather than legitimate medical treatment. The fraudulent insurance claims had provided additional funding for Vanessa's appearance and career development while potentially exposing the entire family to criminal liability. My investigation had also uncovered evidence that Vanessa was fully aware of the fraudulent financial arrangements that supported her lifestyle, as email and text communications showed her actively participating in discussions about how to maximize the family's ability to redirect resources toward her needs while minimizing scrutiny from other family members or financial institutions. The documentation I'd assembled included bank records, credit reports, tax returns, insurance claims, and digital communications that painted a comprehensive picture of systematic financial fraud that had been ongoing for over 15 years. The evidence was sufficient to support criminal charges including identity theft, tax evasion, insurance fraud, and conspiracy that could result in federal prosecution and lengthy prison sentences for everyone involved. But perhaps the most valuable evidence was recorded conversations where my parents and Vanessa explicitly discussed their fraudulent activities and their belief that I was too naive and trusting to ever discover or challenge their systematic theft of my financial resources and identity. Their confidence in their ability to manipulate me indefinitely had led them to document their crimes in ways that would make prosecution straightforward and conviction virtually certain. As I compiled the evidence of their criminal behavior, I realized that my mother's ultimatum about canceling my wedding had actually provided me with the perfect motivation and justification for exposing fraud that had been victimizing not just me but potentially other family members and government agencies for over a decade. The family that had treated me as expendable was about to discover that their disposable daughter had the skills and evidence necessary to send them all to federal prison. 3 days after my mother's ultimatum about canceling my wedding for Vanessa, I made a decision that would destroy our family forever but would finally provide justice for 15 years of systematic fraud and emotional abuse. Instead of giving in to their demands or simply cutting contact, I chose to weaponize every piece of evidence I'd gathered to ensure that their criminal behavior would have the devastating consequences they'd managed to avoid for over a decade. The first step in my nuclear response was contacting the IRS Criminal Investigation Division to report the tax fraud that my parents had been committing for years through fraudulent dependent claims, unreported income, and false documentation that had reduced their tax liability while funding Vanessa's lifestyle. The evidence I provided included detailed financial records showing the systematic nature of their tax evasion and the substantial amounts of money they'd avoided paying through fraudulent claims. Simultaneously, I filed a comprehensive identity theft report with the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, providing documentation showing how my parents had used my personal information to obtain unauthorized credit, secure fraudulent loans, and create financial obligations in my name without my knowledge or consent. The federal investigation that followed would have the authority to pursue criminal charges carrying sentences measured in decades rather than years. But I didn't stop with federal agencies. I also contacted our state's Insurance Fraud Investigation Unit to report the fraudulent medical and therapy claims that had been filed to fund Vanessa's cosmetic procedures and lifestyle coaching. The insurance fraud evidence included detailed records showing how legitimate medical necessity had been fabricated to support claims for procedures that were purely cosmetic or recreational in nature. The civil litigation I initiated included lawsuits for identity theft, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and emotional distress that would ensure my parents faced financial consequences even if they somehow avoided criminal prosecution. The evidence supporting these civil claims was overwhelming and would result in judgments that could force them into bankruptcy while providing me with compensation for the financial and emotional damages I'd suffered. Most devastatingly, I provided evidence to our local district attorney's office showing that my parents had been defrauding elderly relatives and family friends by soliciting money for fabricated emergencies and medical expenses that were actually being used to fund Vanessa's career and lifestyle. The elder abuse charges that resulted from this evidence carried particularly serious penalties and would ensure that their crimes received maximum media attention. The timing of my legal offensive was carefully calculated to create maximum disruption during the period when my mother expected me to be canceling my wedding and surrendering to their demands. Instead of compliance, she received a series of subpoenas, investigation notices, and legal documents that made it clear her ultimatum had triggered consequences she'd never anticipated or prepared for. The reaction from my parents when they began receiving federal investigation notices was immediate panic followed by desperate attempts to contact me and negotiate some kind of resolution that would prevent the criminal prosecution from moving forward. Their sudden willingness to discuss compromise and apology revealed how completely they'd misunderstood both the scope of evidence against them and my determination to see justice served. Vanessa's response was equally predictable. Immediate denial of any knowledge of fraudulent activities followed by attempts to portray herself as another victim who'd been unaware that her lifestyle was being funded through criminal behavior. Her claims of innocence were undermined by the digital communications I'd uncovered showing her active participation in planning and coordinating the fraudulent schemes that had supported her for years. The family meetings that my parents desperately requested were attended by my attorney, who made it clear that any communication about the criminal charges would need to go through legal channels rather than family discussions. The people who'd spent decades treating me as someone whose feelings and rights didn't matter were suddenly discovering that I had legal representation that prevented them from continuing their patterns of manipulation and emotional abuse. The media attention that followed the criminal charges was particularly devastating for my parents' reputation in our community, as local news outlets covered the story of parents who'd systematically defrauded government agencies and family members to fund their favorite daughter's lifestyle while committing identity theft against their other daughter. The scandal destroyed their social standing and professional reputations in ways that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Vanessa's photography business and social media influence were also casualties of the criminal investigation, as potential clients and brand partners distanced themselves from someone whose career had been revealed to be funded through fraud and identity theft. The artistic success she'd been so proud of was tainted by the knowledge that it had been built on stolen money and criminal behavior. The extended family's reaction to learning about the systematic fraud was shock followed by anger at being manipulated into contributing money for fabricated emergencies while their funds were actually being used to support Vanessa's luxury lifestyle. Several relatives who'd been victimized by the fraudulent solicitations joined the civil litigation as additional plaintiffs seeking restitution for their losses. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of their downfall was watching how quickly the family hierarchy that had oppressed me for decades completely collapsed once the criminal behavior was exposed. The golden child whose needs had always taken priority was revealed to be a co-conspirator in criminal activities, while the expendable daughter they'd tried to manipulate was now the person controlling their legal fate and financial future. The wedding that my mother had demanded I cancel became a celebration of my liberation from family members who'd been systematically stealing from me while treating me as less important than their criminal conspirator daughter. James and I proceeded with our ceremony as planned, surrounded by friends and chosen family who supported our relationship rather than people who viewed my happiness as disposable for someone else's convenience. As federal agents executed search warrants at my parents' home and seized the evidence that would support their prosecution, I realized that their ultimatum about choosing between my wedding and my family had actually been the perfect choice. By choosing my wedding and my own happiness, I'd lost family members who were criminals and gained the freedom to build authentic relationships with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could sacrifice for their benefit. 2 weeks after I'd triggered multiple federal investigations into my parents' criminal activities, their comfortable suburban life had been transformed into a nightmare of search warrants, asset seizures, and criminal defense attorneys as the scope of their fraud scheme became clear to federal prosecutors who specialized in complex financial crimes. The evidence I'd provided had been so comprehensive and well documented that the investigation was moving with unusual speed toward indictments that would carry sentences measured in decades rather than years. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division had been particularly interested in my parents' case because it involved sophisticated tax fraud schemes that had been operating for over 15 years while generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid taxes and fraudulent refunds. The systematic nature of their tax evasion, combined with the identity theft they'd used to maximize their criminal profits, had elevated their case to a priority investigation that was being used as a model for prosecuting family-based financial fraud operations. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who was leading the federal investigation, had told me that my parents' case was one of the most well-documented fraud schemes she'd encountered in 12 years of investigating financial crimes. The detailed records I'd compiled had provided federal prosecutors with everything they needed to secure convictions without requiring extensive additional investigation or witness testimony that might be unreliable or compromised by family relationships. The FBI's investigation into the identity theft had revealed that my parents' criminal activities extended beyond their theft of my personal information to include fraudulent use of other family members' identities for various criminal schemes. Elderly relatives who'd trusted them with personal information for supposedly legitimate purposes had actually been providing documentation that enabled additional credit fraud and government benefit scams. The most damaging evidence that emerged during the federal investigation was discovery of a sophisticated money laundering operation that my parents had been using to hide their criminal proceeds while maintaining the appearance of legitimate income. The photography equipment and business expenses that supported Vanessa's career had been purchased through shell companies and fraudulent business entities that enabled them to claim tax deductions while hiding the criminal source of their funding. Vanessa's role in the criminal enterprise had been clearly established through digital evidence showing her knowledge of and participation in planning fraudulent activities that supported her lifestyle and career development. Her attempts to claim innocence were undermined by recorded conversations where she discussed strategies for maximizing fraudulent benefit claims and minimizing the risk of detection by family members or government agencies. The civil asset forfeiture proceedings that accompanied the criminal investigation had resulted in the seizure of virtually everything my parents had acquired through their criminal activities, including their house, cars, investment accounts, and Vanessa's photography equipment. The lifestyle they'd been maintaining through fraud was being systematically dismantled to provide restitution to their victims and fund the costs of federal prosecution. The insurance fraud investigation had uncovered additional evidence of systematic deception involving fabricated medical conditions, forged doctors' notes, and fraudulent therapy claims that had generated tens of thousands of dollars in illegitimate benefits. The medical professionals who'd been manipulated into providing documentation for non-existent conditions were cooperating with investigators while expressing shock at how completely they'd been deceived by my parents' sophisticated fraud schemes. The elder abuse investigation had revealed that my parents had been targeting vulnerable family members and family friends for years, using emotional manipulation and fabricated emergencies to extract money that was immediately redirected to support Vanessa's lifestyle and career expenses. The pattern of exploitation had victimized over a dozen elderly relatives who'd trusted them with their savings while believing they were helping with legitimate family crises. The media coverage of the federal investigation had been extensive and devastating for my parents' reputation in our community, as local news outlets followed the story of educated, middle-class parents who'd committed sophisticated financial fraud to support their favorite daughter while victimizing their other daughter and numerous family members. The contrast between their public image and their criminal behavior had made the story particularly compelling for journalists and readers. Vanessa's social media presence had been completely destroyed by the criminal investigation, as her photography career and influencer brand became associated with fraud and criminal activity rather than artistic achievement. The followers and brand partnerships that had provided validation and income were rapidly disappearing as people learned about the criminal funding sources that had enabled her success. But perhaps the most satisfying development was watching how my parents' criminal prosecution had completely vindicated my decision to pursue legal remedies rather than family reconciliation. Every choice I'd made, from documenting evidence to refusing their ultimatum to triggering federal investigations, had been proven correct by the rapid progress of the criminal case and the overwhelming evidence of systematic fraud. The wedding that my mother had demanded I cancel proceeded as planned, but with added meaning as a celebration of my liberation from family members who'd been systematically stealing from me while treating me as expendable. The ceremony was attended by friends, colleagues, and chosen family members who supported my relationship and admired my courage in standing up to criminal family members. James's family had been incredibly supportive throughout the federal investigation, offering both emotional comfort and practical assistance as we navigated the complex legal proceedings while planning our wedding celebration. Their genuine love and acceptance stood in stark contrast to my biological family's manipulation and criminal exploitation, making it clear that I'd gained far more than I'd lost by choosing authentic relationships over toxic family obligations. As the federal investigation moved toward formal indictments, I realized that my mother's ultimatum about choosing between my wedding and my family had actually been the perfect choice. By choosing my own happiness and refusing to enable their criminal behavior, I'd exposed fraud that needed to be prosecuted while building a new life based on honesty and genuine relationships rather than manipulation and theft. The family hierarchy that had oppressed me for 31 years was about to be permanently destroyed by federal prison sentences, while the daughter they'd treated as disposable emerged as the person whose courage and intelligence had protected numerous victims from ongoing criminal exploitation. 43 days after my mother's ultimatum about canceling my wedding, federal prosecutors announced a comprehensive criminal indictment against my parents and Vanessa that included 37 separate charges ranging from identity theft and tax evasion to wire fraud and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. The criminal case that had been built on the evidence I'd provided was being hailed by federal prosecutors as a textbook example of family-based financial fraud that demonstrated the sophisticated methods criminals use to exploit trust relationships for systematic theft. The lead prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen, had told reporters that my parents' case represented one of the most comprehensive family fraud schemes his office had prosecuted in over a decade. The systematic nature of their criminal activities, combined with the vulnerable victims they'd targeted and the sophisticated methods they'd used to hide their crimes, had elevated their case to a priority prosecution that would serve as a deterrent to other potential family-based fraud operations. My father's indictment included 23 federal charges that reflected his role as the financial architect of the fraud scheme, including tax evasion, identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy charges that carried potential sentences totaling over 70 years in federal prison. His background in accounting and financial planning had enabled him to create sophisticated money laundering operations that had hidden their criminal proceeds for over 15 years. My mother's indictment was equally devastating, with 18 federal charges that included identity theft, elder abuse, insurance fraud, and conspiracy charges that reflected her role in targeting vulnerable family members and coordinating the fraudulent solicitations that had victimized dozens of relatives and family friends. Her manipulation of elderly relatives had been particularly damaging to her legal position because elder abuse charges carried enhanced penalties under federal sentencing guidelines. Vanessa's indictment included 16 federal charges that established her as a full co-conspirator rather than an unknowing beneficiary of her parents' criminal activities. The evidence of her active participation in planning fraudulent schemes and her knowledge of the criminal funding sources for her lifestyle had eliminated any possibility that she could claim victimization or ignorance about the illegal nature of the activities that supported her career. The civil asset forfeiture proceedings that accompanied the criminal indictments had resulted in the seizure of over $800,000 in criminal proceeds, including the family home, investment accounts, luxury vehicles, and all of Vanessa's photography equipment and business assets. The lifestyle that had been maintained through criminal activities was being completely eliminated to provide restitution to victims and cover the costs of federal prosecution. The plea negotiations that followed the indictments revealed how completely unprepared my parents and Vanessa were for the consequences of their criminal behavior. Their attempts to minimize their involvement and shift blame to each other had actually strengthened the prosecution's case by providing additional evidence of their criminal intent and systematic coordination in planning fraudulent activities. My father's cooperation attempts had been unsuccessful because federal prosecutors were unwilling to offer significant sentence reductions to someone whose sophisticated financial expertise had enabled such extensive fraud over such a long period. His detailed knowledge of accounting and tax law had actually made his crimes more serious in the eyes of federal prosecutors who viewed professional expertise as an aggravating factor rather than a mitigating circumstance. My mother's defense strategy had focused on portraying her as a devoted mother who'd made poor choices to help her daughter, but the evidence of her systematic targeting of elderly family members had made this approach completely ineffective. The elder abuse charges had created additional legal complications that made plea bargaining virtually impossible while ensuring that her case received maximum media attention and public condemnation. Vanessa's attempts to portray herself as another victim had been completely undermined by the digital evidence showing her active participation in planning criminal activities and her explicit knowledge of the fraudulent nature of the activities that supported her lifestyle. Her recorded conversations discussing strategies for maximizing fraudulent benefits while minimizing detection had eliminated any sympathy jurors might have felt for her claims of manipulation or ignorance. The impact on our extended family had been profound, as relatives who'd been victimized by the fraudulent solicitations came forward to share their experiences and express their anger at being manipulated into funding criminal activities while believing they were helping with legitimate family emergencies. The family gatherings that had once celebrated Vanessa's achievements were replaced by meetings with federal investigators and victim advocates. The media coverage of the criminal indictments had been extensive and devastating for my parents' reputation in our community, as news outlets documented the sophisticated nature of their fraud schemes and the numerous victims who'd been harmed by their criminal activities. The contrast between their public image as successful parents and their reality as federal criminals had made their story particularly compelling for journalists covering white-collar crime. The professional consequences for my parents had been equally severe, as my father's accounting license was suspended pending the outcome of his criminal trial, while my mother's volunteer positions with various charitable organizations were terminated when the organizations learned about her criminal charges. Their social standing in the community had been completely destroyed by the revelation of their systematic criminal behavior. Vanessa's photography business and social media career had been completely eliminated by the criminal charges, as clients canceled contracts and brand partnerships were terminated when companies learned about her involvement in systematic fraud and identity theft. The artistic career that had been funded through criminal activities was permanently tainted by the revelation of its illegal funding sources. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of their legal destruction was how it had completely vindicated my decision to pursue criminal prosecution rather than family reconciliation. The evidence I'd provided had not only ensured appropriate consequences for the people who'd victimized me, but had also protected other potential victims by exposing and dismantling a criminal operation that had been harming innocent people for over 15 years. The wedding that my mother had demanded I cancel became a celebration of justice and liberation from family members whose criminal behavior had finally been exposed and punished. The ceremony was meaningful and joyful, attended by people who supported my decision to prioritize honesty and integrity over family loyalty to criminals, while the people who demanded my sacrifice were facing federal prison sentences that would separate them from society for decades. As I watched my parents and Vanessa being led away in handcuffs after their arraignment hearings, I realized that their ultimatum about choosing between my wedding and my family had actually been the perfect choice. By choosing my own happiness and refusing to enable criminal behavior, I'd helped ensure that justice was served while building a new life free from the manipulation and exploitation that had characterized my relationship with them for over 30 years. 6 months after the federal indictments, the criminal trials of my parents and Vanessa had become a showcase for federal prosecutors demonstrating how family trust can be systematically exploited for sophisticated financial fraud operations. The comprehensive evidence I'd provided had made conviction virtually certain, while the trials themselves served as a public reckoning for decades of favoritism, manipulation, and criminal behavior that had destroyed innocent victims while enriching the people who should have been protecting them. The prosecution's strategy had been to present my parents' case as a comprehensive criminal enterprise rather than isolated incidents of poor judgment, using the extensive documentation I'd provided to show the systematic nature of their fraud schemes and their sophisticated methods for avoiding detection while maximizing criminal profits. The evidence was so overwhelming that defense attorneys had been forced to focus on minimizing sentences rather than challenging guilt on the underlying charges. My father's trial had been particularly damaging because his background in accounting and financial planning had enabled prosecutors to demonstrate that his crimes were the result of professional expertise rather than mistakes or misunderstandings. His detailed knowledge of tax law, banking regulations, and financial reporting requirements had actually made his criminal behavior more serious in the eyes of federal judges who viewed professional credentials as aggravating factors that warranted enhanced sentencing. The testimony about the identity theft he'd committed against me had been especially compelling for jurors, as the evidence showed how he'd systematically stolen my personal information to obtain unauthorized credit and loans while I was unaware that my financial future was being compromised to fund Vanessa's lifestyle. The breach of parental trust involved in stealing from his own daughter had been particularly shocking to jurors who were parents themselves. My mother's trial had focused on her role in targeting elderly family members for fraudulent solicitations, with prosecutors presenting evidence of her systematic manipulation of vulnerable relatives who'd trusted her with their savings while believing they were helping with legitimate family emergencies. The elder abuse charges had been particularly devastating because they involved victims who were sympathetic and credible witnesses whose testimony painted a clear picture of calculated exploitation. The evidence of my mother's systematic lies to elderly relatives, fabricating medical emergencies, financial crises, and family disasters to extract money that was immediately redirected to support Vanessa's lifestyle, had been particularly damaging because it demonstrated a level of calculated cruelty that shocked jurors and eliminated any sympathy they might have felt for her claims of maternal devotion. Vanessa's trial had been the most dramatic because her defense strategy had involved attempting to portray herself as another victim who'd been manipulated by her parents into participating in criminal activities she hadn't understood were illegal. This approach had been completely undermined by the extensive digital evidence showing her active participation in planning fraudulent schemes and her explicit acknowledgement of the criminal nature of the activities that supported her lifestyle. The recorded conversations where Vanessa discussed strategies for maximizing fraudulent benefit claims while minimizing the risk of detection had been particularly damaging because they demonstrated criminal intent and sophisticated understanding of the illegal nature of her activities. Her claims of innocence and victimization had been thoroughly discredited by evidence showing her enthusiastic participation in criminal planning and coordination. The victim impact statements that were presented during the sentencing phase had been devastating for all three defendants, as family members who'd been defrauded described the financial and emotional damage they'd suffered through trusting people who'd systematically exploited their love and concern for fabricated emergencies. The elderly relatives who'd been targeted for fraudulent solicitations were particularly compelling witnesses whose testimony highlighted the cruelty of the defendant's criminal behavior. The sentencing phase had been equally devastating, as federal judges had imposed maximum penalties that reflected the scope of the criminal enterprise, the vulnerability of the victims, and the defendant's complete lack of genuine remorse for the devastation they'd caused. The sentences were designed not only to punish the defendants but also to deter other potential family-based fraud operations. My father received 32 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, a sentence that effectively ensured he would die behind bars while reflecting the serious nature of his role as the financial architect of the criminal enterprise. The judge had specifically noted that his professional expertise in accounting and financial planning had made his crimes more serious rather than providing grounds for leniency. My mother received 28 years in federal prison, with the judge emphasizing that her systematic targeting of elderly family members had demonstrated a level of calculated cruelty that warranted the maximum possible sentence under federal guidelines. The elder abuse charges had carried particularly serious penalties that reflected society's commitment to protecting vulnerable older adults from family exploitation. Vanessa received 24 years in federal prison, with the judge noting that her active participation in criminal planning and her sophisticated understanding of fraudulent schemes had eliminated any grounds for claiming victimization or reduced culpability. Her youth had not provided grounds for leniency given the extensive evidence of her criminal intent and coordination. The restitution orders that accompanied the criminal sentences had required the defendants to repay over $1.2 million to their victims, money that would be collected through the liquidation of seized assets and ongoing garnishment of any income they might earn during their imprisonment. The financial consequences would follow them for the rest of their lives, ensuring that they could never rebuild the wealth they'd accumulated through criminal activities. The civil litigation that had proceeded alongside the criminal trials had resulted in additional judgments that exceeded $800,000, money that would provide compensation for the emotional distress and punitive damages that reflected the egregious nature of their criminal behavior. The civil judgments would survive their prison sentences and continue to affect their financial situations for decades after their eventual release. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of the trials had been the complete vindication they provided for my decision to pursue criminal prosecution rather than family reconciliation. Every choice I'd made, from documenting evidence to refusing their ultimatum to triggering federal investigations, had been proven correct by the comprehensive nature of the criminal convictions and the extensive evidence of systematic fraud that had been harming innocent victims for over 15 years. The media coverage of the trials had been extensive and generally supportive of my decision to expose family criminal behavior rather than protecting criminals because of blood relationships. Editorial coverage had praised my courage in prioritizing justice over family loyalty, while recognizing that my actions had protected numerous potential victims from ongoing criminal exploitation. The extended family's reaction to the criminal convictions had been overwhelmingly supportive of my decision to pursue prosecution, as relatives who'd been victimized by fraudulent solicitations expressed gratitude that the criminal behavior had finally been exposed and punished. The family members who'd initially criticized my decision to involve law enforcement now acknowledged that criminal prosecution had been the only appropriate response to systematic fraud and identity theft. The professional recognition I'd received for my role in exposing the criminal enterprise had actually enhanced my career prospects, as colleagues and employers recognized that my analytical skills and commitment to integrity had been instrumental in stopping sophisticated financial fraud that might have continued for years if I hadn't had the courage to investigate and report criminal behavior within my own family. The psychological healing from such profound family betrayal had been gradual but meaningful, helped by therapy, legal vindication, and the knowledge that I'd responded to systematic criminal exploitation with strategic thinking and appropriate legal action rather than emotional retaliation or enabling behavior that would have allowed the crimes to continue. My relationship with James had been strengthened by our shared experience of surviving family crisis and criminal prosecution, as we'd supported each other through the complex legal proceedings while building a marriage based on honesty, mutual respect, and genuine partnership rather than the manipulation and exploitation that had characterized my family relationships. The wedding that my mother had demanded I cancel had ultimately taken place as planned, but with added meaning as a celebration of liberation from criminal family members and the beginning of a new life built on authentic relationships rather than fraud and manipulation. The ceremony had been attended by chosen family members who supported our relationship and admired our commitment to each other despite the family crisis we'd navigated together. As I reflected on the year that had passed since my mother's ultimatum about choosing between my wedding and my family, I realized that their demand had actually provided me with the perfect opportunity to choose justice over criminal complicity while building a life based on integrity rather than enabling systematic fraud and identity theft that was harming innocent people. 3 years after my mother's ultimatum about canceling my wedding for the Golden Sister, I'm writing this from the home office of our beautiful house, where wedding photos on my desk serve as daily reminders that choosing my own happiness over family criminal demands was the best decision I ever made. The family hierarchy that had oppressed me for 31 years has been permanently destroyed by federal prison sentences, while the daughter they'd treated as expendable has built a life that exceeds anything they could have imagined during their years of systematic fraud and favoritism. The most satisfying development has been watching how completely the narrative about our family has been rewritten by the criminal convictions and federal prison sentences. The golden child whose needs had always taken priority is now serving 24 years in federal prison for fraud and conspiracy, while the expendable daughter who was supposed to sacrifice her wedding is now being praised for her courage in exposing criminal behavior that protected numerous innocent victims. My career as a software engineer had been significantly enhanced by the investigative skills I'd demonstrated while uncovering my family's criminal enterprise, leading to consulting opportunities with law enforcement agencies who valued my ability to analyze complex financial data and trace sophisticated fraud schemes through digital evidence. The trauma of their betrayal had been transformed into professional expertise that made me more valuable and respected in my field. James and I had not only survived the family crisis but had emerged with a stronger marriage built on shared values of honesty, integrity, and mutual support that had been tested by the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Our relationship had been strengthened by surviving criminal prosecution and family destruction while maintaining our commitment to each other and our shared future together. The house we'd purchased with money recovered through restitution payments represented more than just financial compensation. It was a symbol of justice served and a foundation for building authentic relationships with people who valued honesty over manipulation and integrity over criminal convenience. Every mortgage payment we made was a reminder that truth and law had ultimately triumphed over family criminal behavior. The extended family relationships that had been damaged by years of fraudulent solicitations and manipulative lies were gradually being rebuilt based on honesty and mutual respect rather than exploitation and deception. Relatives who'd been victimized by my parents' criminal schemes now understood that my decision to pursue prosecution had protected them from ongoing exploitation while ensuring that the criminals faced appropriate consequences. The social dynamics in our community had also completely shifted in my favor, as people who'd once admired my parents' apparent success now recognized them as federal criminals whose comfortable lifestyle had been built on systematic fraud and identity theft. The contrast between their previous reputation and their current status as convicted felons had made my decision to expose their criminal behavior seem both courageous and necessary. My professional reputation had been enhanced rather than damaged by my association with the criminal case, as colleagues and clients recognized that my ability to detect and document criminal behavior within my own family demonstrated the same analytical skills and commitment to integrity that made me valuable in my cybersecurity work. The case had become a showcase for my investigative abilities and ethical standards. The therapy I'd pursued to process the trauma of family betrayal and criminal exploitation had also provided me with insights about healthy relationships and boundary setting that had improved every aspect of my personal and professional life. Understanding that my family's criminal behavior wasn't a reflection of my worth had been essential for building confidence and self-respect that enabled authentic relationships. My financial situation had been completely transformed by the restitution payments and civil judgments that had recovered not only the money stolen from me but also provided compensation for the emotional distress and future damages I'd suffered through their criminal activities. The money that had been stolen to fund Vanessa's lifestyle was now funding my own goals and security in ways that reflected justice rather than criminal exploitation. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome had been the knowledge that my courage in exposing family criminal behavior had protected numerous other potential victims from ongoing exploitation while ensuring that systematic fraud was stopped and punished appropriately. The family members who'd initially criticized my decision to pursue prosecution now acknowledged that criminal behavior required criminal consequences regardless of family relationships. The golden child whose wedding was supposed to take priority over mine was now in federal prison where weddings weren't an option, while the daughter who was supposed to be expendable had built a marriage and career that represented everything our parents claimed to value but had never actually supported through their actions. The favoritism that had shaped our family for decades had been permanently reversed by the consequences of criminal behavior. The most empowering realization had been that my mother's ultimatum about choosing between my wedding and my family had actually been the perfect choice. By choosing my own happiness and refusing to enable criminal behavior, I'd gained the freedom to build authentic relationships while ensuring that people who'd systematically exploited family trust faced appropriate legal consequences. So here's my question for everyone who's followed this incredible journey from family ultimatum to criminal justice. Have you ever had family members demand that you sacrifice your happiness to enable their dysfunction, only to discover that standing up to them was the best decision you ever made? Sometimes the people who threaten to disown us are actually offering us the gift of freedom from toxic relationships that were harming us more than helping us. My mother's demand that I cancel my wedding for the golden sister was intended to reinforce a family hierarchy that kept me subordinate and exploitable while protecting criminals from the consequences of their behavior. Instead, it became the catalyst for exposing systematic fraud that needed to be prosecuted while liberating me to build a life based on integrity rather than criminal complicity. If this story has resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about family golden child syndrome, the courage required to expose family criminal behavior, and the freedom that comes from choosing justice over enabling dysfunction. Share this video with anyone who's ever been treated as less important than a favored sibling, or anyone who's discovered that standing up to family bullies can lead to justice and liberation. Drop a comment telling me about your own experiences with family favoritism, golden child dynamics, or times when choosing your own happiness over family demands led to better outcomes than you could have imagined. Thank you for joining me on this journey from family ultimatum to criminal justice. Remember that people who demand you sacrifice your happiness for their convenience are often revealing their own willingness to exploit your loyalty for their benefit, and that sometimes the best response to family ultimatums is choosing the option they think you'll never have the courage to choose. The family that threatens to disown you for standing up to their dysfunction might actually be offering you the freedom to build authentic relationships with people who value your happiness rather than your willingness to be exploited.